Good afternoon, everyone. So I think we're waiting for a few more colleagues to join in, but I think in the meantime, we'll get started. So thank you very much for taking the time to be here with us. And it's sort of a follow-up to a side event that we had last year when we are developing this core human rights principles for private conservation organizations and funders. So it's really, really great to be back here with an amazing panelists and the speakers here with us today. So my name is Suyang Hwang. I'm a legal officer in the Law Division of UNEP, United Nations Environment Program. And the purpose of this event is following the site event that we had last year. We wanted to bring your attention to the final version that we released last year in December, and also have an exchange on the views on the development and the operationalization of the principles, as well as to discuss overall the right-based approach to conservation with the amazing panelists we have. So a quick round of introductions I will do is, so to my right, we have His Excellency Jose Francisco Cali-Tazi, Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the United Nations in Geneva. And he was one of the key persons who supported the development over the past 2 years in the development of the core principles, as all the capacity as the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people. So we're very, very happy to have him in his new capacity. And we have, to my left, we have Astrid Prentes Briano. So as you know, she is a special rapporteur on the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and who we also had the pleasure of having involved in the development of the principles and have a support for the principles. And then we have another colleague, but I think he's joining a little bit late. And we have Elaine Geyer-Eleli from WWF International, and it's
She's already here.
so great. Sorry. sorry, I didn't see it. I don't have the view of so maybe I'll finish introducing Elaine. So Elaine has so she's with WWF International, has been like huge supporter of a human rights based approach to conservation, and has been really helping with the development and as part of the WWF International, but also working with other conservation organizations. And to my right, I'm very sorry, like Ghazali Uhurella, he's from he's an indigenous rights expert from International Indian Treaty Council, and I really want to say special thanks to IITC for sending an input request for like so many indigenous peoples organizations and consolidated the views from over 70 organizations, which we are very, very happy to reflect their views and advice in the principles. And then we have, I always know her as Tina, so I had to ask her, how do I actually pronounce your first name? Because I've known her for many, many years, but I never called her with the full first name. So Manaralini Rai, she's an executive director for Women for Biodiversity, and she's been working in the space for UN Convention on Biological Diversity for a very, very long time, and has been really key in giving us advice on the gender-based approach to our core human rights principles, among others. So welcome, everybody. And we have two more speakers who are joining us by video messages. And Milka Cherokore, she's a representative of Sangwar people and a climate and human rights expert. And we have Proven Moodley joining from ICCA Consortium. So those will be they'll be unfortunately joining us by video messages, but they're very, very happy that we're here today. So maybe I will turn to our agenda. Like quick agenda is I'll have a very quick overview of the final human rights principles, core human rights principles for conservation organizations and funders. And then we'll move on to the panel discussion and open the floor up for any questions and answers from the floor. Could I have the slides, please? So very pleased to share this the final version, which we actually all of us on this podium, and also like those who are joining us online and who are actually like on the floor on the sitting in the room, helped really shape this and then develop this and finally be able to launch it last year. So the objective of the principles was to promote human rights-based approach to conservation and also contribute to the CBD's Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was very welcomed as it has a lot of human rights components in it, including the rights of Indigenous peoples and gender perspectives, as well as environmental defenders. And but also to clarify the application of international human rights standards to private conservation efforts, because a lot of work that we do are addressing public sector, such as how the governments are doing in terms of meeting the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework or abiding by the other environmental commitments. But what can we do to promote the private sector efforts in the conservation? So this is where we started, and wanted to have an area that is lacking, and then a set of principles can really guide and benefit what's happening on the ground as and efforts by the private organizations and the funders. And that was based on the sources included. We didn't want to create a new set of rights or principles. So these all principles are based on the International Bill of Rights, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as a UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And the process, I think we actually mentioned about this process. It was sort of a very, very long process, intense work, and through the consultation with many stakeholders. And so we really aim to have a participatory and inclusive process. So we had many consultations online, offline, and also asked for the call for inputs. And we did our best to integrate all the inputs. And the action oriented, we didn't want to just sort of have this is a good to do, but then principles really emphasize on like how the practical guidance that we can give, and also like we know that we're going to also work on more on the how to and on the how to, like, so these are the principles that we published, and is based on the existing norms, but how can this be implemented, and all this will be actually worked on, and this is an approach that we are taking. And it's also it linked to the action oriented. It's an open-ended process. So we don't see the launch of the principles as the end. We actually see this is a one step that we took, and then we are going to work actually with everybody here and with all the stakeholders and our partners to towards a more implementation side of the principles, and that to make sure that the human rights are respected and upheld in the conservation efforts by everybody. So the publication was launched in December last year, and with the support of over 70 organizations and experts, and is available on the UNEP website. And we have made Spanish, French, and English versions available, and you can also use the QR code to access the report. So I'm not going to go over the whole all 10 key principles, but you can see how that's based on the respecting human rights and the rights of Indigenous peoples, as well as others, and taking human rights due diligence as one of the key principles, and also what happens when the violations, abuses happen. So we have also principle on the remedies, and also defenders, and also how to deal with law enforcement. So I hope you will have time to have a look at it if you haven't. So the implementation, we're going to have, as I mentioned, that we have a few plans that we're going to actually talk more with our partners. One idea is to have the community of practice, because we have realized that there are so many talks about human rights and also talks about biodiversity, but we don't really have a designated space where we talk about conservation and human rights as the main topic, and also like multi-stakeholder space where we have conservation organizations, we have experts, we have indigenous peoples organizations. So we want to sort of build a community of practice, build to the implementation of the principles, and have more focus and area discussions about how to implement, for instance, what do you mean by human rights due diligence? How can it be done? And what are the practices can we see in the ground, on the ground that has happened, that what is good and bad, what kind of lessons can we learn? So these are also like in the planning that we want to do more. And also capacity building came out as a strong component that can contribute to the implementation. So a lot of funders have also said, funders, we don't have any training on human rights and how to make sure that our funding contributes to human rights. So capacity building for funders, but also like a lot of conservation organizations have mentioned, some of them they're actually doing their own training on human rights, but also others mentioned that we haven't actually done it, like we need this. So those are like a summary about what we have planned, and this is not set in stone, so we'll be continue seeking your views on this our planning. So I have taken up so much of my time, so that we'll move on to more exciting parts. So we'll move on to the panel discussion, and I'm very happy to have Ambassador Jose Francisco with us, and thank you very much. So here's a question. Given your contribution to the development of the core principles and recognizing that they are directed at private conservation organizations and funders, how do you see the role of states and council members in creating an enabling environment for their effective implementation?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. And it's an honor for me to participate in this important event. And I thank, of course, the United Nations Environment Program for the invitation to this essential dialogue and the intersection between conservation and human rights. I believe that one of the things that we have to be, or to have very clear, is that conservation cannot be separated from respect for the fundamental rights. Private conservation organization and funders have an inescapable responsibility to respect the right of indigenous peoples. And history has shown that when human rights are ignored in the name of conservation, it not only generates injustice, but also undermine the effectiveness of environment effort. So that's why I believe that the best way is that a state and the members of the council has to respect what has been stated in the UN Declaration of the Right of Indigenous Peoples, but also on the Convention 169 of the International Labour Organization. And of course, in this way, I will invite all the members of the Council and members of the UN that has not ratified Convention 169 to do so, because it's not against the state, it's to strengthening the rule of law to not only to protect, but also to respect indigenous people's rights.
Okay, thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a really good message. Actually, when we are doing this work, we're actually surprised about how many countries ratify the ILO convention. So it's really great suggestion, concrete suggestion that first step is to ratify what's existing. That will also help to implement the core principles and to make sure that the rights of indigenous people are respected and the rights are realized. So now I'll turn to Astrid. So thank you very much for Astrid for being here. I know you're very busy as well. So Astrid, here is your a question. So how do the core principles contribute to ensuring that biodiversity conservation efforts uphold human rights including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, particularly within the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework.
Thank you very much, Suyang, and UNEP for organizing this event and for the principles. Let me know if you hear well. So one of the key added value of the principles, and the reason that I also supported them, is that while we know that there's a lot of conservation efforts from private entities, there are also challenges and unfortunately sometimes situations where there has been human rights violations. But the consequence of having a very compartmentalized world is that in a lot of situations, the human rights obligations that are clear for states are not as clear for businesses and private actors. Even with the UN guiding principles, one of the things that we still are hearing, and it happened also in the process for the conservation principles, is that private conservation entities, while it can be funders or organizations, either argue that they didn't think that they had human rights obligations or that they ignore what those obligations are. And so in that sense, to me, this core human rights principle for private conservation helps to bring people that are not aware or has not a lot of expertise on human rights to the world of human rights, and to clarify what are these obligations and how are these obligations being implemented. It also, in that way, of course, helps to identify these human rights violations and reduce them, but also reduce systemic inequalities, inclusion and discrimination, and the power imbalances that we see in the ground. And Ambassador Francisco Cali mentioned that the imbalance that we sometimes see between Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant, peasant communities in the territories when this has happened. I also want to highlight that, of course, the principles are not going to solve everything, but in a lot of ways it brings, or the principles can help to understand what are these conflicts, what are these obligations, and how to solve them in a way that it can also advance the implementation of obligations for states, because it brings everyone in the same it balances the table also in terms of obligations of everyone that is involved in conservation efforts.
Thank you, Astrid. Yes, we had hoped that principles will solve all the problems, but I think this is a way that, of course, we will have to make it work. So I think this is why we are here, and that we are going to continue working on this. And I just wanted to mention actually that what you mentioned about like systemic discrimination and power imbalances, this is something that we actually really picked up and came strongly while we were doing the consultations, especially in certain countries, like also like a lot of indigenous peoples, they were like systemically and historically disempowered. And there's a power imbalance is really an issue. And I really hope that our principles will also contribute to resolving this issue and make sure that Indigenous rights have all the rights realized. So now is a good way actually to turn into our the colleague from International Indian Treaty Council. So Ghazali, welcome again. And so here's a question for you. Could you tell me why is the meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in conservation essential? And how can the core principles help ensure that their rights, including self-determination and free prior informed consent and traditional knowledge, are respected?
Sure. And also thank you very much for the invitation and for the organizers for hosting this very important event, and also facilitating like civil society and indigenous peoples actually in terms of developing these principles. IITC did have a hand in gathering indigenous peoples to for consultations on these principles, and we're very happy to have been able to contribute in that way. And also I apologize for being late. Just ironically, just two doors down, there's negotiations on human rights defenders and environmental and indigenous rights defenders. the language is under attack. So that's why I came in late, because I had to defend that language. So, which is very pertinent to what we're doing here right now, and also why it's very important for the principles as well. Obviously, of state actors, and as the ambassador very eloquently said, about the need for respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples, ILO Convention 169, and human rights in general. There's also a very important role for private sector funders, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's no coincidence that at the beginning of the month, the expert mechanism, the chair, the Burma Forum chair, as well as Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, issued a letter highlighting the disproportionate application of funding to Indigenous peoples. And by disproportionate, we wish it was disproportionate, but it's the negative end of it. What only like less than 11% of funding actually goes to the ground. And that is also something that we, in our consultations and workshops that we did with amongst Indigenous peoples, is that over 60% of the respondents reported negative conservation impacts. And 76% of the respondents were not informed or unsure about conservation funding affecting their lands. So based on respondents, based on what we're hearing in other rooms, it is very evident that excluding Indigenous peoples, it's not just unethical, it's a strategic failure of the United Nations and the member states. And that is something that again, the principles, and they're not like the silver bullets, but it is going to help. It is going to help to address the problem that we're all facing. And I'm very grateful that the principles include the rights of Indigenous peoples, free from consent, which is a derivative of self-determination. Let's not forget that. And also like that there's the role of knowledge of Indigenous peoples. Thankful also that you mentioned traditional knowledge, but it's very important also to know that the knowledge of Indigenous peoples is not traditional. It's not old, rusty, and dusty. It's still in development. It's still it's scientific almost. And those are all principles and understanding that the funders and private sector need to start understanding. And through the application of the principles, that is a start. That is a start towards ethical engagement with Indigenous peoples. The last thing that you want to do when you talk about conservation and sustainable development, and I'll stop there, is that the last thing you want to do is to chase the people that are taking care of the land off the land. I think that is like the one thing that we all should be keeping in mind. That's not what we should be doing. We should be protecting those that are effectively taking care of the people. So and it all starts with the meaningful participation. We kind of like no, I don't want to say steal it, but we borrowed it from the disability movement. Nothing about us without us, and that applies not just to people with disabilities, but it also applies to Indigenous peoples, and particularly when you emphasize the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the right to participate in decision-making processes. And so it all starts with the participation of Indigenous peoples, not only in decision-making, but also in allocation of funding, and when it comes to the conservation efforts that under the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, climate change, BBNJ, all the other instruments that are out there. So we're very grateful that the principles have is coming to fruition, and very highlighting that it is definitely open-ended, and we're very much looking forward to everyone to picking this up and breathing life into it, because that is the next phase of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kazali. There's so much that I can actually learn from your statement. So first of all, thanks for defending for the environmental defenders, and also this is a concern for everybody, and it's a huge priority actually for UNEP and also a lot of UN entities. And yeah, so like nothing about us without us. I think I'm I cannot agree with you more about it. I was actually with the CRPD, like Convention on Rights of like persons with disabilities, like negotiation years and years ago, and that was like something that I still try to like apply in the work we do, and yeah, also just some idea that I want to share about your direct funding for Indigenous people. So this came up quite a lot as well, and this is also part of the core principles. And from the UNEP side or the UN side, what we can really do is that we're trying to promote more on the good result from the direct funding, and also Indigenous peoples manage the conservation areas and so on. And so that's one that's one area that we're really looking into. Like people should know more about actually how good they are doing and how good they have been doing, and how they should actually continue, should be able to continue doing this. So thank you very much for your excellent statements. And so now we'll move to Elaine. And thank you very much, Elaine, like for being here with us. And I know it's you know, it's always good to have like people open-minded and organizations that have been engaging in such a process, and so really appreciate being here and also like supporting the principles for the last 2-3 years when we're developing it. So Elaine, can you explain how the core principles can support WWF and other conservation organizations in advancing human rights-based conservation?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's great to be listening to colleagues and to be part of this conversation. Maybe just a quick word on WWF, so the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Some may know us as a World Wildlife Fund, which 2 of our offices have as their name. But we're a very large global network, around 80 offices in around 100 places. And working from very, very local levels, sometimes in highly remote areas, all the way to national, regional, and global levels. That gives us a particular perspective on the world, and the real experience in terms of how things are happening on the ground. We have a complicated governance structure because of that composition and that structure, which means each office has its own strategy. Some have their own boards. But we are bound together by 4 things: a shared mission, a common agreed set of values, and also the WWF brand. We also have a core set of standards that all offices and staff have to adhere to, and I'll come back to that as it's directly related to our conversations today. And then just basically in our agenda, many people know us as a wildlife conservation organization. That was our focus when we were created in 1961. And it's still part of our core business to work with others to protect species and core and critical places and ecosystems for the benefit of people and nature. But actually our agenda is much broader, and we also engage across different biomes, but also in the policy, financial, and economic systems that have driven us into the exceptionally serious crises of nature loss, environmental degradation, and climate change that we're facing today. So just very quickly on a couple thoughts on the core principles and how they support WWF and other conservation actors. As many of you know, the first of that is in terms of strengthening our own organizational systems and standards to ensure that conservation does no harm and contributes to people's well-being. And other panelists have already alluded to past examples of where that has not been up to standard. As many of you know, WWF had a challenging time several years ago, following allegations about human rights abuses by government rangers and other law enforcement agencies in some of the areas, protecting conserved areas around where we work. And looking back, over almost 5 years now, we've really traveled such a long way since those painful days, and the recommendations of the independent panel review that we commissioned that reviewed the allegations and our responses really catalyzed changes in the ways that we work. And I'll just highlight a few of the areas where we've made network-wide investment over the last several years in our systems and standards. So first, our updated environmental and social safeguards framework, which applies to all of our place-based activities. That's now been rolled out in nearly all of the almost 300 landscapes where we work across the world. That's generating huge learning about what does it mean to actually implement these standards in practice. We also have conservation law enforcement guidelines, which were one of the other areas of weakness we found that are finalized in development around things like prohibited activities or financial payments. We also have an orientation note on human rights due diligence in the context of law enforcement, which is in the final stages of development, and my colleague Rob Perry-Jones is here in case anyone has particular interest in that. All WWF offices have also committed to work to uphold our updated statements on human rights, statements of principles on human rights, gender equality, and Indigenous peoples. So just these few examples mirror quite a lot of what the core principles lay out. And in this context, the core principles are very helpful benchmarks against which we can check our suite of mechanisms and standards to identify where we're on the right track or where we still have areas to address or strengthen. And one example there would be, for instance, we're still progressing the work on effective grievance mechanisms. We have established those as part of our ESS approach, but we see that they work better in some contexts than in others. And we're looking to learn with communities and others on how to improve those. We also expect our new ombudsperson to help us work on problem resolution where that's possible and effective remedy when needed. And adhering to Principle 10, if you're interested in knowing more detail on these different areas, you can find the reports, annual reports we've done for the last 3 years, as well as the report of the independent evaluation that was completed last year on our website. And please feel free to reach out to me if you need help. I'll just say a few other words on a parallel investment, however, that we've been making in addition to the safeguards and other standards and the print statements and principles, and that is in building a mindset and a culture and capacity for deepening a shift to inclusive approaches and to rights-based approaches in our work. These don't relate directly to the core principle, but we believe they're critical to actually the successful scaling down and out of WWF's own standards, as well as the principles. Over the last several years, we've been working with offices across the network to distill 9 good practices of inclusive conservation. These include things like learning from the past to inform our work in the future, developing shared agendas, and how do you do that? Reshaping partnerships for more equitable relationships, and appropriately supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities' leadership in their lands and territories and waters. This is soft guidance, they're not standards, but they're meant to provoke thinking, reflection, and exchange to help build a common understanding and culture, not just internally, but also with the people we'd like to be working with. It's also a whole of organization approach. What do I mean by that? It's not just about conservation design. It's about our approach to communications. It's about our operations. It's about our resource mobilization. We've seen a huge pickup, which is really energizing and encouraging, to the point that amplifying locally led conservation is now one of 6 pillars in our new network roadmap to 2030. And that will include things like increasing support to Indigenous and community conserved areas, helping catalyze more funding for the conservation sector, which we know is dwarfed by all the funding that goes to unsustainable activities, but also helping to ensure that more of that goes to Indigenous peoples and local communities directly. And finally, there'll be an internal benchmark on offices' pickup of inclusive conservation. And I think, finally, last point, as we have worked on this, we're seeing that pursuing inclusive and rights-based approaches, requires the capacity to see and work differently, particularly in complex, challenging contexts. Over 60% of the places where WWF works, for example, are considered unstable. And so as a result, part of our approach to building a human rights-based approach and inclusive approach is building capacity to navigate power dynamics, to understand them, to work in conflict and fragile situations, and to counter environmental corruption, which does vast harm to both people and the environment. We're also advocating with others in global policy frameworks for human rights-based approaches like we've seen now in the global biodiversity framework. So I think here the core principle is the exciting opportunity, and this idea of a community of practice is tremendous, because we know it's comparatively easy to get the words on paper, even though it's not necessarily easy to agree those. But actually, it's how do you put them into practice? And I think there's, I can speak on behalf of the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights member organizations. There's keen appetite to exchange on learnings and approaches, successes and challenges, and also to build a more common voice. We can all see the pushback on human rights, including the rights to a healthy environment, closing civic space, and threats to environmental and human rights defenders. We need to be working together across sectors, as we've begun to do more closely, and this is an excellent opportunity for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elaine. So I think that what you mentioned about the cultural change is like really a key, because I think the world is not just a private conservation, but I think also government run protected areas. It's so we're held up in this idea of like fortress conservation, which is really like we cannot protect the environment or nature without people. And so I think that's cultural thinking change will be also needed to make sure that we have the right space approach to the conservation in what we do. And also like, you know, cultural, like just going back to what Casali said also about like traditional knowledge, that this is something also like, you know, we need to think a bit differently about like whenever we call the indigenous knowledge or is a traditional knowledge, but it's a Western is science. So like we actually get this question quite a lot from our the partners. So it's like, no, it's like it's not, you know, how we say it should also like change, and the way we actually frame also should change, and that will change our thinking and also the culture and finally our behavior. So thank you very much, and I also like really appreciate your commitment to continue to engage with us on this. And also about learning is something that the Special Rapporteur on Climate Change, Elisa Mogera, has like really emphasized about learning, that she said, you know, learning should really be part of these core principles, that we have to continue learning and continue improving ourselves in the way we do things. So thank you very much, Elaine, again. And now we'll move to Tina. So Tina, could you tell us how a gender-sensitive approach to the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework strengthens biodiversity outcomes, and how can the core principles help ensure this approach?
Thank you, Suyang. This is like very good. You can really come close. Do I need to have the clicker now? Oh, perfect. It's here. Hello, everybody. I'm pretty loud. I'm going to be louder on the mic. So thank you so much for joining up here. And it is, for me, it is an amazing opportunity, because believe it or not, this is actually my first Human Rights Council meeting that I'm attending. But I must say that some of the rooms that I've been to, it's amazing that the negotiations are almost the same thing between paragraph by paragraph and fighting for words. So I'm like, great, I'm in the spot that I should be. So thank you, UNEP partners, and all those panel speakers for also giving this opportunity for us as Biodiversity to be here and present. Especially also, like Suyang said, we've also been partnering with UNEP to see how do we also really bring more vitality to this whole discussion. But having said that, I'm still stuck on my slide one. Sorry about that. I didn't also not link up some of the recent discussion that have been taking place, and which is literally 2 days ago in New York. If you know that the Commission on the Status of Women, the 69th session started, and it is really very important, because it was, for me, it was a very difficult choice. Where do I go? Do I go to the CSW or do I go to the Human Rights Council? And to be honest, I chose to come to the Human Rights Council because I thought that what I could do as my role was kind of bring in some of those discussions to build in some of the synergies and things. And I just want to kind of share one thing before I go there, is that On March 10th, the CSW, the member states adopted by consensus a very powerful political declaration to respect, protect, and champion the right, equality, and empowerment of women and girls. And this was very context. And today was my first day at the Human Rights Council, and I really want to read this out because I was like, oh my God, they both are discussing the same thing. So I just wanted to take a moment because, like Ghazali talked about, we're talking about so many things here and over the last week. In the political declaration that was just adopted by almost the same member states, there's a paragraph 5 there, and these are literally the agenda of the Human Rights Council meeting. It says, reaffirm the need to respect, protect, and promote all human rights and fundamental freedom, civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights, including the rights to development for all women and girls through their life course without distinction of any kind, while upholding the rule of law, the principles of equality, non-discrimination, and ensuring equal access to justice, freedom from violence, and removal of all structural barriers to the empowerment of all women and girls, taking into consideration the diverse situations, contexts, and conditions of women and girls. So I want to set the stage there before I quickly go on my presentation. So I'm just going to go on briefly that you all are very aware of the 10 principles, and I wanted to really share this out so Young also knows that we always try to save paper. So we actually always have an e-version of this. So I wanted to also share to everybody who's new is what the principle actually looks like. And I will not go on all the principles because you all are, have read this. But just saying that my work, what Young had asked me, was saying that how about the CBD and biodiversity and the KMGBF, which is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So setting up the stage from the CBD, first and foremost is that the CBD, the Biodiversity Convention, in its preamble text, recognizes the roles and contribution of women to biodiversity conservation. So that's our foundational ground. And the work that we have been doing with many others in the CBD is how or what can we operationalize that aspiration of the convention into the whole work of the CBD, including its agenda items. And one element that I want to share, and this is the link with the KMGBF, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, is that in 2022 at COP15, a few things happened. One is the absolutely monumental highlight was the adoption of a standalone target for gender equality, commonly known as everybody knows Target 23, and also Target 22. It also is to ensure the gender responsiveness aspect of that target. And together with that, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, I want to familiarize people here at the Human Rights Council of what it really meant. Together with the target, you also have the Gender Plan of Action, which is adopted under CBD Decision 1511. And I'm sharing this because there are so many elements that this is the reason why we supported it, because I thought that the core elements that talks about in this principles are really very relevant. And I think that as I talked about, how do we make it operational? So you can look at the decision with more details, and maybe you will change your icons. This is my version of the icons of the Gender Plan of Action. So basically it talks about gender and environmental link. It talks about the modalities for it, is that how important it is for us to really recognize the roles and contributions of women and biodiversity. The other element that it talks about is about the coherence and coordination. And this is an element of that. The Human Rights Council, the SDGs, the climate, the UNCCD, and all the others, is how can we really look into. And if you look at in all these processes, you do have a gender plan of action or gender action plans. So how do we really consolidate to really ensure we have an integrated approach to that? Then of course, the crust of this is that it has to be a human rights-based approach. There has to be intersectionality and structural barriers. We need to really understand that. Without really understanding the needs and priorities of women or Indigenous women, local women, young women, women with the diversities, we will not be able to put in the actions in place, which have to be very specific to the needs and aspirations. And of course, we always keep talking about the meaningful engagement in these. And in this one, and the relevance of this, having understood that one. Now, this is my last slide. Sorry, I'm kind of going really very fast. I'm not going to read everything. Is that the way that we see that this core principle is really very important as in the gender plan of action. There is a provision there that talks about not only engagement of how the implementation of the GBF is going to be done only by the parties and the secretariat, but there is also a lot of discussion around the private sector and the public sector, but there is no provision of how or who they are. They just said, all private, public sector are going to be engaging and seeing how they could partner in the gender implementation of the KMGBF. So this is where I think some of the elements that we could, like I think our colleagues have talked about, that the principles they could be expanded, they could be chosen from. For some organization, it could be principle 1, 3, 10, or something else. But it is a start. It is time for us to kind of get this discussion started as a guidance for other engagement organizations who may or are already thinking of investing in nature, right? So just on that one, so you can read the descriptive, but so again, this is our interpretation of some of those links of how possibly we could look into that, and they are repetitive. It is not something that we are saying, reiterating, to be honestly, coining an expression. It is something that has been understood, has been recommended by all of us in different spaces. This is talking about equality and non-discrimination. These are some of the elements that are taken from the principles and seeing what could possibly be a gender responsive outcome to those ones. So we talk about non-discrimination, engaging everybody, ensuring human rights is there. That means giving women, starting by giving them equal opportunity. You talk about participation and empowerment, right? What does it really look like? You're talking about starting from education. We have communities, we don't even have access to education. We're always talking about STEM. We're talking about giving, empowering young girls. It can be simple as education. You're talking about capacity building and leadership opportunities. This is one of the very crust of the CBD, and I don't think we have really discussed this in many other spaces, and I want to build up here, is the access and the benefit sharing of resources. A very key element that we should definitely be looking at, and this is where we're talking about traditional knowledge, Indigenous peoples, but also understanding is how can we also ensure that we recognize women's traditional knowledge or their contributions and how they can be supported. Then we also talk about gender-specific needs that I've always talked about. And we are also talking about a very crucial element is on the gender-based violence and harassment. And there are, again, studies being done on the impacts of gender-based violence and environment. And these are things that are linked up with projects, funders, private organizations, and how do you really make sure that the gender-based violence elements is also streamlined within that, and then FPIC comes within that. Then there's gender-sensitive monitoring and accountability. You may have plans, you may have projects, you may have funding, but without really also ensuring how your plans are working out, because you may have to change them midway. For that, you need to have a very transparent, very robust mechanism for accountability. And inclusive and cultural sensitivity approaches, these are also really very crucial elements to really look at, because we come from communities that are very diverse, very geographically different, very culturally context. And so we really need to also make sure that when conservation organization partners do come with it, they don't come with a blanket uniform plan. They come with investment looking at the local context of what's really happening. And within that, what are the roles of women? You also really need to make sure that, and it's a reality, that addressing women's rights or human rights is a sensitive issue at a local context. So how do we really address that in a way that we are not doing harm, but really making sure that we are grounded? We can't just make use of human rights and saying that that's the name of human rights. No, we also have to have a conscious effort to really make sure that we are actually really doing it in a very conscious manner. And of course, we always keep saying that sometimes going back to the basic is capacity building and awareness raising. We really need to do more, for also conservation organization and funders to understand what those links are with biodiversity, those links. We need to also simplify those acronyms. And I think beyond the Human Rights Council and the CBD and the climate, when we're talking about KMGBF targets, how do we really simplify it so that they are also really understanding to really ensure that human rights is actually truly core work and not just like a tag or a name branding that everybody just puts in the report. So thank you. I've rushed. I've talked a bit fast, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tina, and I really appreciate that you chose the Human Rights Council over WCWS. So thank you so much. And it's really good to have actually like colleagues who are mostly working on CBD and other areas like to come to Human Rights Council to make the synergies and the links between all this work that is actually basically the same, like work better. So thank you so much. And I'm getting slightly conscious about the time. So we have like two more speakers, but like on a video message. So we'll hear from Milka Korea, who's been like really instrumental in for the past years in shaping the core human rights principles, and Kuvan Moodley from ICC Consortium, who's also been a key member actually for the development and the implementation. So we have the video messages.
Greetings, everyone. These principles, as we all know, are not new. However, this had to be done given the very many experiences of conservation gone wrong, where Indigenous people are evicted from their lands, some kept away from accessing their waters, their herbs, sacred places, and other resources within their lands. All these violations are happening even in the presence of international human rights law, and more specifically the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that should safeguard Indigenous people's rights. With the finalization of these core principles and eventually their adoption by different conservation organizations and funders, we hope that more responsibility will be taken to keep the principles alive and implemented. While that will be happening at the levels of conservation organizations and funders, Indigenous peoples organizations and those working with Indigenous peoples are encouraged to translate the principles and to make them available for consideration by Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples may then adopt them as a whole or in sections as part of their community bylaws, therefore using them as their bare minimums whenever they interact with conservation organizations and funders in their territories. This then ensures that the principles are adhered to by the conservation organizations and funders, whether they have adopted them at their level or not. I see this as a sandwich process to achieving Indigenous people's rights, rather than leaving this, again, for conservation organizations and funders to choose to implement or not. Indigenous peoples are equal partners in conservation.
I'm very sorry that like due to so we have to vacate the room in the now in 1 minute. So I'm very sorry that we had to cut the video messages short, but we're going to post this video messages online and the Geneva Environment Network's website. So please go and check the messages out. And thank you very much for all those who joined us online, and also like those who were in the room, and the co-sponsors and all the speakers. I thank you so much for choosing to come here and then taking the time out of your, like, I know it's a very busy time of the year. So thank you so much. And I also want to thank my colleagues from Geneva Environment Network, Diana, and also Harvey, who's been helping and doing an amazing job behind the scenes to make this happen, as well as my colleague who's based in Colombia, who might be up to actually watch up now to watch this live, Mariana Montaja. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of the council seconds.
Okay.